Hello, and welcome everybody to the companion podcast to Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, and I'm joined here by my co-author, Steve Orr. Steve, how you doing?
Great, Ray. Another episode raring to go.
Fantastic, fantastic. In this episode, we're diving into chapter 5 of our book. And this one is really about how to generate content for your podcast. It is one of the biggest challenges of the many challenges of launching and hosting a podcast, especially a sustainable one, is, of course, creating content that just doesn't fill time, but really connects with listeners. And so, our goal here in this episode is really to talk through why content is the foundation to any successful podcast. We're going to talk about the common obstacles that people face when they're hosting to stay consistent. And then, of course, some of our strategies for generating compelling ideas and stories to build that sustainable workflow. So, let's go ahead and lock in, Steve. This is, again, I think we're both pretty passionate about this piece of the book. It's an area where we both enjoy narrative, we enjoy storytelling, and we don't have to be strong storytellers in order to build strong stories in podcasts. This is a learned skill. So even if you are kind of a dud at a cocktail party, you can learn to do this. So just know that you can do this. So let's start into really the first part of our discussion today in terms of setup. We talk about this in three parts: kind of setup, confrontation, and then the resolution. Let's talk about that concept of setup. What do you mean when you talk about setup?
So, first of all, yes, setup, confrontation, and resolution. Uh, Basic. That's the traditional three-part structure of whether it's a film, a novel, a play. Just very basic structure. So the setup is basically the world that you're going to operate in. The confrontation part is the challenges, the obstacles that you might face. And the third part of that is the resolution. At least in this we kind of adapted this slightly for the book from the traditional setup, confrontation, resolution. But the resolution part is really kind of the insights and solutions you might have. Um, if you're doing an interview podcast, it doesn't matter if you're doing a solo podcast, a podcast with hosts, co-hosts, and the like, can work for any format. So that's kind of the basic that we're talking about here.
Yeah, we had talked about, when we were thinking about this chapter, that we would go through all the various types of storytelling models, and we both, I think, agreed that it would probably be too much, right? If we were really trying to put in an essential blueprint, not the full treatise on storytelling in podcasting, that we really needed to narrow it down and to create something that was, as you said, an adaptation, but a kind of an addend a shrunk down, a compressed
Yeah,
version
very
of that.
simplified. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so folks could
Yeah.
understand it just on a very basic level and still get as much value out of what it really means to create a three-act structure in a podcast. And that's pretty much what we're talking about here. You don't have to have kind of the Shakespearean structure. We talked in the, or at least we mentioned in the book, the concept of Freytag's pyramid. Of course, there's the hero's journey, which is notably Joseph Campbell's work in how, look at any Disney or Pixar film, you're going to
And there's
see that kind
Pixar's
of.
pitch. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
even
it's
the
going to be, you're
Pixar
going to see.
pitch. Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to see the narrative arc and style of that in those films. And you can use all of those. I would say, there's no reason why you couldn't use any of those. The point in us doing it this way was that if you're a business owner and you don't know this stuff and you don't care, you can still do it utilizing what we've put here in terms of that setup, confrontation, and resolution.
I think what it does is well, not only again, are we doing kind of a simplified version, but it gives somebody, that structure so that you're not doing, let's say you're doing an interview podcast and you have this random list of questions and you want to be more focused with that interview so that you have that narrative, even if it's not, the traditional narrative of storytelling. It's a narrative with your guest rather than just some random questions here and there, like what's your favorite tree? You know, unless it's all about trees, and that's part of your narrative structure. But just being more really utterly just be focused.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that people frequently get befuddled by, and I see this happen in a lot of podcasts, especially interview style podcasts, which tend to be the formula of a lot of business podcasts. And I'm not casting aspersions. I think it's a great format. I've used it obviously over many years. But what will happen is people will get on, they will have a little bit of hello, hi, how's it going? Let me introduce this person by reading a bio, and then we'll go into a series of long droning questions, and or ask a bunch of questions up front and not letting the interviewee answer them one by one. And so therefore they kind of have to remember what the four or five questions were that you asked, and then answer the questions. Maybe they answered them piecemeal. And so this structure gives you a real ability. One, yes, you do need to set up the authority and the reputation of the individual who's about to give the quote unquote advice or the help, but you're supposed to set them up for success in those regards. So you don't have to come out the gate with saying, reading their CV, right? You could come out with a unique way to introduce them while still not starting out with, okay, well, your bio says, right? Be a little bit more creative. It's a little bit more of an interesting hook to maybe tell a story about that individual, and then segue into that person saying, yeah, well, actually in that circumstance, X, Y, and Z happened. And then you can say something then, well, that makes a lot of sense because your bio here reads, or, what I know about you is that you studied, this particular thing in your degree program, or you have this experience in the workforce, and that really lends credibility to now the story you just told, and brings the listener in along for the journey. And again, I've definitely done this. I have read a bio and then done the interview questions. So that's not, I'm not saying what I haven't done, but I think there are more interesting ways to do this now. And it's good to kind of think about the setup, confrontation, and resolution mechanism now, or method now, so that you're able to start thinking about this in a little bit more of what's going to appeal to the listener. Different than, again, when we talk about hobby or, other podcasts, you cannot care about what your listener is going to hear because it's probably you and your friends. But when it's the business, you have to start
That's
thinking
different.
about, yeah, right. You just have to start thinking, flipping that script and thinking, okay, what's the listener value here, and how's the listener going to approach this? And I know I come up against that quite a bit myself, in the sense that I want to make this the most efficient process. But I think there's a way to do that. That's really really helpful.
And I
So
just
this,
wanted to say for a moment, if I can interrupt you for a moment, but that's a
yeah,
theme that we've touched on in some of our previous episodes, and we're probably going to be doing it again. And it's the audience comes first. And you really have to look at things from the audience perspective. And you need to establish a couple of key questions from the listener perspective, just even before you begin anything. And that is two questions I always tell folks. I call it the two why principles. Moment here to mention that. But it's, why does this matter? Why is this significant? And why should I care? And getting back to that, the listener is always going to want to know what's in it for them. So if you are crafting, you know, this setup, confrontation, resolution, you need to always keep that in mind.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And our prior chapter was really about helping people understand how to approach a podcast on a more podcast host level kind of structure of the podcast, podcast length, that kind of thing. Now we're really delving into a deeper level of the content itself. And this really helps to unearth what that kind of structure is going to be once you are on the mic. And so I hope that the example we provided of the episode, really helps people to kind of understand what the cadence of the actual parts and segments of an episode are going to look like. Every podcast is going to be a little bit different. Not everyone's going to be a banger, right? To use a British expression. But the idea here is that you want to make sure that you set up your interviewee, if it's going to be an interview style podcast, you want your interviewee to sound good. You want them to be glad that they were on your podcast, because the little unknown kind of spoken secret here is that your goal is to have them promote your podcast episode. So if they feel like they sounded like garbage, that they didn't feel like they brought their best self to the episode, frequently they will not promote themselves, right? Which means they're not promoting your podcast, which means your podcast is not going to grow. So the more you empower them to be great on the mic, show up with their best self, shine a light on them, the more likely they're going to go out there and take that little episode and be like, oh my God, that's my little baby. Let me go share that with everybody out there in the world. Look at my little chick, right? Um, but if they don't, then they're gonna be like, yeah, I'll just, I won't share that on social. I won't send that out to my email. We want to create that's something that's mutually beneficial, one that you feel good about creating, but one that also really makes your guest look great. And this, again, it goes beyond interview, because even if it's you and your podcast host, or you solo, if you don't feel like it was good, then you're not going to share it as much, right? You're not going to be excited about it as much. We want to create that level of excitement. And I think by having a good story arc that you feel confident in telling, you're gonna want to share it. All right, let's talk about some of the perhaps challenges and obstacles that folks approach when they are trying to create the content for their podcast episodes.
To me, one of the biggest challenges is just finding fresh topics each and every week, again, that will appeal to the listener. I think it's as simple as that. And trying to figure out, well, where am I going to find that information? Where am I going to find the topic that I want to talk about that will appeal to my listeners as well? I don't want to go into how we can do that just yet. I'll tease it, Ray. But just know that, to me, at least, having conversations with folks over the years, that is one of the key challenges. Another challenge, and we had a lot of discussion about this, and we feel very strongly about this, is that you have to be extremely careful about making your episodes too promotional for your business and making it in an infomercial.
Right.
And that, to me, is a big challenge for folks, is figuring out, well, okay, how do I do this and yet appeal to my listener and then have them not think that it's just a commercial for my business?
Yeah, and this is where we had quite a bit of dialogue, because I explained to Steve that my experience working in many different economic development agencies around the country, I would see people not sell themselves enough, right? They would always kind of be too shy, right? They, being a salesperson is kind of gauche to some folks, and so they don't sell themselves enough. And so I really wasn't too worried about that, but there was a need for us to say something that really help to separate kind of content from kind of the advertising executives if you're in kind of a media world. And so I think one of the best ways to think about this is, one, there are natural ways in which you can show, don't tell people what you do. And so that concept of show but don't tell, and Steve and I talked about this a lot as we were writing the book, wanting to kind of do that level of demonstration. But and I'm a tell person. I'm definitely a tell person, not a show person. I want to literally write out every step, and go from there. But the goal, though, in being able to do that from a sales perspective, is that if I just tell you what I know, and I actually am an expert authentically, then you're going to get it. You're going to get what it is that I do. The other part is that, like a blog or a podcast or a video, you control the editorial. So you can insert your own ads into those things. One of the best things that I ever did was that I stopped talking about my business altogether in my blog when I started. And all I would do was insert a literal ad for my services into the blog. So instead of having people purchase advertising in my own blog, I advertised in my own blog, And that was it. That was the editorial and the advertising completely segmented from each other. And I just think about the same exact thing when it comes to podcasting now. If I want to do an ad, it's in my intro or in the outro. Everything else is to provide voice and value, right? And that's that voice over value concept, and it's pretty simple when you think about it from that perspective. What are your thoughts there, Steve?
No, I would agree with that, and I want to add one other challenge here because, everything you said, no, I agree with what you said. I wanna add one other, which I believe is an extremely important point here, and we had discussions about this and putting it in boldface in our book actually about, do not just have a guest on your show for the idea of turning them into a client.
Mm, yeah.
So that can be a challenge for folks because you may say to yourself as a business owner, well, why am I wasting time talking to this person who might not be an eventual client for me? And, where do you go? How do you, I think the biggest challenge for you, Ray, because you're more in this world than I am, honestly. How do you go about making sure that your guest will not be, you're not eyeing your guests solely for them to be a client and pitch them for your business?
Yeah, because I mean, so I take the advice from David Allen, which is that if you're not feeling discomfort, you're not playing a big enough game. And so the whole idea that I would be talking to clients who aren't already successful in what they're doing to be able to share their experience with others. They don't need to be successful across everything. They just need to be successful in the area in which I'm talking to them on the podcast. And so the goal there is to be able to shine a light on them, to feature them in the way in which they have excelled. And that might be just in their email marketing. And maybe their social media is currently still bollocks, right? Maybe they are dealing with their automation really well, but they're having financial problems because they lost a bookkeeper. Like, people have all kinds of stages of where they are in their business. So if I'm gonna interview someone, I'm gonna interview them because one, they're an expert in their field, and rarely interview people where I'm going to be interested in them being a client. Like, I never got that idea. It never dawned on me that I would interview people as a mechanism for them to then want to work with me because I've just never needed that type of promotional activity. So I always wanted to bring the best people I knew onto the podcast to share their story with people because I felt like that would be empowering to them as a small business owner to hear someone who has been in the trenches and has been successful in that particular area of their world, whether that be in franchise business, franchise development. I've had franchise consultants on the podcast. I've all kinds of folks come on the podcast for those things. It was never about making them a client because it just it never even dawned on me. It just really didn't, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. But I will say this. The thing that and actually several people from my podcast over the years have become clients, they've become friends, they've become all kinds of things, you know what I mean? So that's not really the goal of it though. The goal of it
Mhm.
is to establish a relationship. And I've found that an hour of podcast together is like sometimes 3 or 4 months of relationship building. You get to know someone really, really well when you're in this concentrated period of time talking to them about issues that are deeply close to them. And when you start talking about superficial stuff with them on the podcast, that's when the connection is lost. The vibrance in the conversation kind of lulls out. That's the stuff that you got to cut out of the podcast. And so I would just recommend everyone find what people are passionate about and interview people who are passionate about the things that you want your audience to hear.
Yeah, and that's what we would do, but, again,
Yeah.
we just wanna make sure that we put that out there, and I know, again, we had discussions about this, putting that out there. I can't speak English today. Putting that out there just to be clear, and another challenge I believe, and this can go both ways, whether you are a guest, and we're gonna talk about guesting in a later episode, but also as hosting your own podcast, we wanted to put up another note which can be challenging for some because some think, okay, well, here's my opportunity to make money potentially off of a guest by charging them to appear on my podcast. We say absolutely not. No, no, no. Do not do that. If somebody approaches you that way, I actually had an email from someone who was approached and, in the fine print was, we're going to basically charge you a fee for appearing on our podcast.
Right, right.
Stay
And again,
away
this
from that.
there is a place for that potentially if you're a big podcast influencer and so on and so forth. But and again, that's for other people. But
Yes. And I
you know what I mean?
still
Like,
wouldn't have anything to do with that. But yes.
right, right. I mean, but you have journalistic integrity. There's all kinds of an ethics. You know what I mean? So there's a place for where that happens. It is still very very uncommon for someone to be paying anyone for being on a podcast, and certainly vice versa. So like, just take money off the table because this is a cost of doing business if you are choosing podcasting as your primary marketing channel. Right? That's the whole point of the book. Right? Is that you are using your podcast as the generative, basis for your entire content strategy. And why would you want to limit yourself by only being able to entice someone onto a podcast by virtue of charging them? Like, gatekeeping in that regard just seems foolish, right? You would want the
Mhm.
biggest pool and the best people to want to come forward to be on the podcast, and really, paywalling is not the way to create the best content. So like, I don't even care about the ethics or the morality of this. That's beside the point to me. What I care about is the quality of the podcast, and it will diminish if you're paying to play for guests, or making guests pay to play to be on your podcast. Either way, it's going to be bad for you. And I don't do it. Steve. If anyone
Mhm.
were to ever tell me that I mean, like, I could turn on my own microphone and reach my own audience without paying. So I don't need you for that. But the goal is to be able to figure out, for the business, how to promote effectively with your guests. If you're going to do a guest style podcast, again, we're focusing on guests in this regard, but we'll get to the next chapter where we're going to talk about being a good guest, and so on and so forth. But the real point here is that you don't need every guest. You need the best guests. And that means doing the best to make sure that they feel taken care of throughout the entire process. And like I said, we'll get there. I did want to circle back though to, you brought up the first challenge of coming up with fresh, relevant episode topics. And this just point just came to me, which is that I never have that problem. And so I always have tons and tons of ideas for new episodes of podcasts that I don't even host. So so I'm a font of new podcast episode ideas. So not that you need to write to me and ask me, but really, if you have a dearth of ideas, just reach out, and Steve and I will have plenty for you. But there's obviously, you can use a Chat GPT or Google Gemini or Anthropic's Claude to brainstorm and ideate. But the one thing that I highly recommend folks to do is to just do what Da Vinci did. Keep a commonplace notebook handy. That could also be digital, like it could be a notebook tool like Evernote or Apple Notes or Google Keep. But as you have ideas, take them down. And I don't mean just ideas about the podcast. I mean, like, you're sitting at your kid's soccer game and you see something novel, or you have a novel thought. By capturing those ideas, you start to create a level of pattern recognition that I don't think people really recognize as being a part of the generative process, a part of the creative. Some people call it creative process. I call it the generative process, because generating things, creating over consumption, is always going to make your life better. And generating, capturing in this particular case, you're capturing ideas. And so you think like, oh, you know what? The soccer coach told the kids that they should approach the goal line, before they kick the ball in a particular way. You know what? That's a really good analogy for how we should approach our business in this regard. And then all of a sudden, you get this new kernel of thought of something. It's amorphous, but it builds into something. But if you didn't capture the thought when you had it, it's lost to the universe. And so I really, really recommend people to capture. I'm always capturing stuff, even if they're stupid ideas, right? Because as Anne Lamott would talk about, you have a shitty first draft. No good book doesn't start without that first, shitty first draft. You've got to be able to craft it into something. A book is in the editing, it's not in the drafting, right? It's in that process of getting it into its final state. And I think the same thing for podcast ideas.
So, and you kind of led into a point that I wanted to make in terms of, jotting down all of these ideas. So how to think about jotting down all these ideas. And that comes, and I can say that comes from me personally, from my journalism training. One of the basic things I learned in journalism school, you may have heard this before, the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, and you can add a 6th, which is how. If you think of things and you ask those questions, that's going to help you with ideas. So think in terms of a journalist when you're trying to figure out, oh, what, I want to talk. I mentioned lawnmowers. We've talked about lawnmowers. So I'll
Well, you keep
continue
bringing
with
up
that
these
theme.
lawnmowers, Steve.
I'm bringing up this theme one more time. But no, just so, okay, so you want to do an episode about lawnmowers. Okay, but what am I doing about lawnmowers? So think in terms of the 5 W's, whether it's the blades, the engine, or something. Maybe that will have you come up with some more specific topics for that overarching subject matter rather, of lawnmowers. So think that will help you think through things. Not only does it help you think through your content, but it can also help you think through the questions you ask if you're an interview host. I don't believe we mentioned that last episode, but I'm going to mention here it can work for you being a host. Thinking about those are the kinds of questions you need to ask to get the information from your guest if you're hosting, if it's a host podcast. So think
I wanted to
think through that too.
I wanted to underscore something that you said because I think it needs to be parsed out a little bit more, and we don't get too deep into it in the book, and I think it's important to be said, which is that one of the reasons for if you're gonna do an episode, say you're a lawnmower repair person, right? And you say I'm gonna do an episode about lawnmower repair, and you outline an episode, and it's an overview of all the various different types of repair, a little history of lawnmowers, yada yada yada, right? So you have this one episode, and you're like, well, now I don't know what else to talk about, that's the wrong approach, right? Like, how do you manifest a project? You break it down into its more fundamental parts, right? So even taking the 5 W's and how, or just a larger topic, break it down into their more fundamental elements, and you get a richer concept of what the podcast episode is supposed to be about. I can talk for 3 hours on just a pencil, an individual pencil in the productivity world, right? Like, are we talking about number 2 pencils? And we could talk about the different colored number 2 pencils, and the eraser structure, and the type of wood we use, and the shape of the pencil. Like how you hold that pencil to be most effective with it. Everyone has an interest in the different types of topics you're going to be listening to, and the more specific, actually, the better for Google, and ultimately for what we now are talking about as GEO, or generative AI engine optimization, right? The AI SEO kind of stuff. Because the more granular you are about every episode, right? And the deeper you go into that one specific thing, the more content is going to be available for them to understand your context, your expertise, your domain authority, and therefore to bring you into, and I don't mean domain authority in terms of URL domain, I mean that in terms of expertise domain. And so that's going to actually get you so much further along than doing just one episode on lawnmower repair.
I know we're back to lawnmowers and pencils. We're going to save pencils for some future episodes.
I was trying to bring us into something a little less lawnmowery.
And that brings up another interesting point, Ray, in that there are so many different angles if you really get into the granular. And if you're really concerned that, oh my gosh, this is only going to be one episode, I'm going to talk about my pencils, think about breaking it up. Think about making them more than one episode about the same pencil or lawnmower topic. That
Yeah.
can generate some more episodes for you and kind of get rid of that problem of, oh, I don't have enough content. What am I going to do? I know I want to talk about lawnmowers and pencils, but I think it's only going to be one episode. No, it doesn't have to be. There are so many different angles. And that goes into the 5 W's and how, if you ask those questions, you'll come up with more ideas on the same particular topic.
Yeah, on that same point, I host a podcast with three other colleagues of mine. It's a hobby podcast, right? But we do it, and sometimes we'll just record an episode and we'll just start going into the agenda, and that agenda may mean that it's 2 or 3 episodes long. We just pause when we get to the end of our recording time, and we'll like see you next week, and then we continue recording on that topic until we've exhausted our debates on that topic. We don't know how big the episode is going to be until we're done recording it. So this is something to consider when you do have guests or if you have a co-host, to think through if this topic is a big topic and it's going to take multiple hours of content that's going to be turned into a series of episodes. Talk to your guest about that up front and say, how long do you think you could talk on this topic? Like really meaty stuff, and that might mean like, okay, we record in one big, like 3 hour block, or we record in several sessions over the course of a few weeks. You don't want it to be like a recording and then like 3 weeks later and then a recording in a month later. There's too much loss in the energy and the vibrancy in the voice. You want that content and the continuity of what you're talking about to stick together.
And
And then you
we
have to
can
listen back to the episode so many times. It's a mess. So keep those recording sessions closer together.
I was just going to say, I had one client that I worked with who did just that with one client, and I believe in that particular topic, we broke it up into a couple of episodes, which was nice. So I wanted to, if it's okay, if I may say that this is one thing that we have not brought up that I'd like to bring up before we kind of move on to our final section as part of a challenge for a lot of folks is a lack of structure. And I'm not talking about the lack of structure with storytelling just yet, because we kind of touched on that. But planning your episode, writing out your episode, getting that structure for the flow of the episode, you are a big believer in that you need an editorial or content calendar.
Yeah.
Let's get into that a little bit as what is the challenge for folks with that? And along with the challenge, as we move into our next section, what are the solutions for solving that issue for folks?
Yeah, so very early on when I was doing digital marketing strategy for small businesses in economic development space, I was seeing a problem with them not being able to scale content. And one of the reasons why they were not scaling content was that they were not doing the job of the ABCs. And ABCs are always be commenting, always be creating, always be capturing, right? And so those are those 3 C's: capture content, capture, create, and comment. And this is all about, again, listening, speaking, and connecting, the foundations of community building. And so I wanted to help them structure their world with things that already existed. And it turns out that, at least in our current calendar system, right, the years are 365 days. It's 65 days and change, which is why every 4 years we have a leap year, because there's a quarter of a day we skip every day, and then we make it up in a day once every 4 years. And so every 365 days, we have a calendar of weeks, months, and seasons. And so I use that structure as basically saying, like, okay, let's just start to containerize ideas so that you're not caught off guard. And one mechanism that I use typically with clients is just their current QuickBooks, right? Looking at their ongoing accounting, because they can see in their product lines and their sales of inventory lines, basically peaks and valleys in their gross revenues and their profit. And so if you look at those particular areas, and or you can even look in like in their if the business is tracking their inventory, you can see where they have their cost of goods sold, their COGS increase over time in particular areas of the year, or they have a balloon of inventory where they get a lot of inventory. It's sitting now. Right now, we're dealing with some tariffs, and so people are buying lots and lots of inventory and holding on to that inventory in preparation for the fluctuation in tariffs happening. Well, all of that is constantly happening in businesses, and if you look at those numbers, guess what? They're happening in a pattern. They're typically happening year over year over year. And so by looking at that data, I started to say, well, let's look at your sales cycle, right? So if you sell a widget on day 10, that means the customer was probably thinking about this maybe on day 5 or day 3. You need to publish your content on day 3 or 5 when they're thinking about you to be able to get there. And so the whole idea around creating an editorial calendar was not just creating and containerizing the content that you were capturing, creating, and commenting on, but it was also placing it into a business context so that you're able to best create the content at the time and place in which the business is going to be seen by your potential buyer. And so that was kind of the whole linchpin of it all, and that was kind of the underpinning of it all. We don't put all of that here in the book, by the way.
No, no.
It's in actually a webinar that's linked in the book and other places, so you can find it there. But this is kind of the underpinning. So just know that there's a lot more underlying why I'm so passionate about this than just like you need an editorial calendar. But beyond that, then you get this really useful integration where now you can containerize topics in for an entire year, multiple years, right? And you don't have to have all the topics at once, but you do have to have the next few topics in place. But now if you have a good idea for something, you have some place where you can park it and put it into structure and start capturing and containerizing it in that way. So having themes for the year, having themes for the seasons, having themes for the months, having themes for the weeks, that helps you kind of create that level of stuff. And I know we already talked about this, but that then helps you do that kind of scaling of content. Because if you create a blog post or a podcast episode or a video as your primary promotional strategy, here we're talking about the podcast. Well, now you have this anchor content, right? That's your content hub, as we talked about. And now you have the hub content. And now you can create all of the little bits and pieces that you have to put out on social media to bring people back to that one piece of primary pillar content, so to speak. That's the point of the editorial calendar. It gives you that kind of just easy structure.
And I believe it's incredibly helpful. And we do create an editorial calendar in the book for our fictional podcasters, Beth and Monique, and the New York City Pastry Pals. So got to buy the book if you really want to know how they have set it up. But when I've done that with a client and the clients in the past as well, like for instance, we created a whole set of episodes around Valentine's Day. That is a theme. And I think we may have had 4 different episodes for the month of February that were geared around Valentine's Day.
Before we were recording, I was chuckling to Steve that some of the topics of the episodes I had written for the editorial calendar just made me chuckle. So hopefully you enjoy some of the fun that we put into some of the book in that regard. But yeah, so
Hopefully, yes.
some of them are funny. I'm sorry. That's just
They are.
not to
No, they are. And
not to pat ourselves on the back, but including, I mean, you actually wrote out the segment by segment structure of the episode, that piece, and and it's just funny to see the wit and humor of Beth and Monique come out in those kinds of scripted parts of not scripted, but kind of outline parts of the episodes as well. So so that's that piece. Let's move forward then and talk about really how to create, generate that sustainable content that has a high level of value that you're going to bring to voice, right? When we talk about voice and value, really, we're now talking about creating that value. You're ultimately going to bring it to voice by putting it behind the mic. But we want to create value. How do you feel like people can create that reliable content stream from the sources?
I believe there are 3 very simple steps that you can take to create and generate this content. First place to look is with your audience. Your audience could be your family, your friends, clients, potential clients. In other words, crowdsource your audience. Poll them, question them, offer some suggestions, get their involvement, which also can ultimately help, generate an audience for your podcast, literally. By involving them and engaging them, chances are they're going to want to listen to see what you've come up with. So that's one very simple way to generate content. Another way to do it is figure out what stories are inside your business. Now, again, it doesn't have to be a product. It could be a story that one of your employees has that will benefit your listeners. And it doesn't, again, necessarily have to be an employee's story about the business itself. It could be an employee's story that has nothing to do with your business, but yet, that's within your business that you can look to uncover some of those stories. Another very easy way is to really just track what's going on in your industry, the headlines, whether you're watching the news, looking at your trades, reading national newspapers, looking on YouTube, wherever you may go. There are stories almost everywhere if you're paying attention. So just pay attention to what's going on in your industry and don't discount something because, oh, that topic's been done. Maybe you have a different angle on that particular topic. And that
Also,
can, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that again comes with the 5 Ws. If you're asking these questions constantly, you're going to uncover more than you know what to do with, most likely.
Yeah, and on the point of it's already been done, it hasn't been done by you, and it hasn't been done by necessarily by you. And flip that is that your audience may not have heard it being done by someone else, and
True.
so the goal here is not for you to necessarily worry about your direct audience um, in um, in having heard it from everyone else. They need to hear it from you. And if they're listening to you, they trust you. And many times the algorithms on the various social networks and otherwise, they're going to bleed out your voice if you're not saying the things that other people are saying in a lot of ways. So you need to be in there in the conversation. You got to be in it to win it. So you got to include yourself in that conversation to be able to be heard in a lot of ways.
And let me
And
I was gonna add one other point about that. Think of it,
oh, yeah, go ahead.
how many artists do a version of the same tune, of the same song? Think of it like that. Everybody has their own unique take to a particular song. Another way to think
Yep.
about it.
Yeah, exactly. There's like a Christmas. Everybody's done the same Christmas songs over and over again. But on the crowdsourcing your audience perspective, I have kind of a flip piece to this that I talk about quite frequently, which is that again, always be capturing, always be connecting, always be commenting. I may have said creating before, but it's always be connecting. Those are the three C's, right? ABCs are always be commenting, always be capturing, always be connecting, always be commenting. And on the capturing side is that every time you meet with someone, whether it's a client, potential client, with a vendor or what have you, you're constantly dealing with typically problems. You're dealing with some inherent form of positive conflict. And that's what you need to capture because those are the really interesting things you want to talk about on the podcast. Now, if you're a divorce attorney, right, you're going to have to be mindful of what you're taking notes obviously into your system, and you want to change details to protect the innocent. But if there are things where a client comes to you and says, you know what, I'm getting divorced because my client likes riding chickens. I don't know, something funny, right? You could be like, oh, you know what, this would be funny, change the details. My client likes riding unicorns. I don't know, whatever. Blow up unicorn dolls. And so it irritates me. I want to get divorced. I'm making it up for purposes of this. But the point is that if you didn't capture that story, right, for the podcast, you're not going to have it. It's not just going to naturally come back to you always. You need to make sure that you're capturing that so that you have it for later. So every type of interaction needs to be captured. And this bleeds a lot into social media also. You go to an event, you take some photo, you take some video of it. I'm terrible at this, by the way. So, pot, kettle, right? You're both black. But the idea here is that um like build a muscle when you go out there representing the business to capture that kind of content, because now you have this reservoir of content that you can source from. You never know when you're going to need it either. You know, like, you know what, we were at this event and remember when we took a picture of the staff together? That's the perfect picture for this now, 6, 8, 12 months later, right? You just never know when you're going to be able to use that stuff. So just always be capturing in that sense. And your conversation with a client today might be a blog post or a podcast episode topic that comes up 6, 9, 36 months later, because now it fits into the editorial calendar. So just remember that if you're not capturing this stuff, it's getting lost. And it's not because you don't have enough content to talk about. It's because you're not on a regular basis emptying your head of those thoughts. In the getting things done methodology, the productivity methodology that I use, we call that a mind sweep. It's a regular purging of all of the ideas you have. And I have to do that more often than others because I just have a lot of ideas that are constantly flowing through overactive amygdala, most likely. But the goal here, not prefrontal cortex, very much overactive amygdala. And so, that constant flow of ideas out of me, though, means that there's never a time when I can't go back to my notes and say, you know what? I probably had an idea about this at one point. The other day I was at the gym. This is just a complete aside. I was at the gym and I was by myself in the gym, so I wasn't going to bother anybody. I decided to just write a complete economic manifesto for small business economic development because I really feel like there was a counterpoint to a particular person's economic development philosophy. And I think a lot of other people have that thought right now. And I just wanted to get it out of my head. And it's going to probably turn into probably a book at some point, not maybe a book, but just something that I want to publish. But it will also turn into probably a series of podcast episodes now that I have thought it all through, and I can bring the experts in each of those paradigms, right? From the tax value of small businesses to the infrastructure elements, to energy policy. All of those things are things that people can talk about. I can find guests for them. And now it's probably 12, 13 different podcast episodes that was just 35 minutes of me talking to myself and having a good chat with Google Gemini. That's capturing, though, right? And we need to find these moments to be able to do that. And when we do, we will not run out of ideas. You are far more interesting. I always say that if you are bored, you are boring. And I know it's a tough pill to swallow. And I don't really feel many people are boring. I really feel like they just need to be engaged in the right way, and they will start to take action that leads them in a direction. So
Yeah,
that's my
everybody
thought.
has a story. Everybody has a story. You just have
Yeah,
to
exactly.
get it out of them. But what? And it's from a business perspective too. Somebody told me this about a business perspective is you plant the seed, and that seed that you plant may grow, and it may take as you were saying 12, 36, 24 months, whatever it is down the road. That seed that you planted may eventually become your client. So same kind of a deal with the information or the ideas that you have. I asked my wife, there are times in the middle of the night that I wake up and I'm like, I got to write this idea down. I don't know why it sometimes happens to me at 2 in the morning, but things come to me and it's like, I got to write that idea down because
Yeah,
I'm going to forget it.
yeah, yeah. Totally get it. All right. So you wanted to talk a little bit about the shaping of episodes using that 3 act structure. What were your thoughts there in terms of helping people structuring their episodes?
I think we actually probably covered a lot of
Okay. Yeah.
it, to
I,
be
I think I
honest.
think yeah, I think we talked about the setup, confrontation, resolution quite a bit. I would note there though that again, you don't have to be a great storyteller, but there is a story to be told in everything that you are saying, in the sense that there is a brand message for your business. Now, a brand is the verbal, emotional, and visual elements of your reputation as a business. And what we want to be able to do is consistently have that in our mind. And as you are doing your podcast, you need to keep that in mind, meaning that there is a type of language that you want to use about your business that's consistent. if you think about why someone goes to a Target or a McDonald's or a Walmart or any other big box retailer or large brand, why people buy from Apple and why they use Windows, they do it because of familiarity with those things. There's a set of all of these very soft touch elements that are part of the brand, right? If you go into an Apple store, you're going to see a Spartan, minimalist, design. It's going to match the technology, right? That Spartan minimalist
Mhm.
design of the technology. It's going to be high quality, premium technology hardware, and that is a brand language. And so we need to bring that to our podcast as well. And so there's a certain style that's just the way in which I podcast. It's rather authentic for me. It's just like I turn on the microphone and I record, and it's as though I'm in front of you live. And that's just my style. I have a particular way of wanting to deal with the world. And I hope that authenticity makes its way through by my voice, by the content that I'm providing, all of those kinds of things. But and when it's in the context of the business, right? I always have that. You may not hear it, but it's that single behind the scenes thread that I care about small business owners. And all I care about is small business owners to my detriment. I really I don't care about anything else. I want small business owners to know that they have someone who's on their side, who cares about them enough not to want to sell them something, but to help them grow and build good community based businesses. And so the goal behind that is that I'm always going to speak in that language, right? I'm always going to use language that is supportive of the small business owner. Sometimes it's tough talk, right? If you're bored, you're boring, right? But other times it's about being empowering and otherwise so that folks know that they do have someone who's a cheerleader for them. And you hopefully have gotten this so far from Steve and I that we are your biggest cheerleaders in launching a podcast. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending these countless hours, talking and putting this book together and so on and so forth. We care about the small business owner utilizing this technology for the enablement of sales and the profitability of their business. So there's that brand message that is kind of core to the values of the business, and I don't want anyone to lose that in like the structure and the three-act structure piece of the putting together the podcast. Even if you're the host and you're interviewing someone, remember the values you're bringing to the table there so that you're conveying the brand message of the business and that's not being lost. So there's a
True.
subtle, I would call it a subtle sales message, but it's implicit, and it's again, it's in using the same language, the same content structure, and also the having the same set of values that you're bringing to the table. And that doesn't mean you can't change your mind, right? You might
Mhm.
come one day and feel like you like blue widgets, and the next day you like red widgets. That's fine, but there's some overarching values, right? There's no time in my life where I'm going to say, you know what, I really like big box businesses over small businesses any day. It's just not going to happen for me. I have too much respect for the millions of businesses that are in business every year, employing most of the economic engine for the United States, right? And Canada for that matter. And throughout the world. I mean, we have global small business, right? I care about them way more than I'll ever care about Amazon or other larger organizations. And I'm a huge Google fan, right? Everybody knows I love Google, right? I've chosen to give them all of my data. Google, be nice to me. But the reality is that that pales in comparison to my love for small business, and I try to show that in the content and the way in which I produce that content. So just keep that in mind. There's a brand message behind the work that you're doing in every episode, even if you're interviewing a guest. So, Steve, you want to take us out? What are your final thoughts as we
So yeah,
close this
yeah,
episode?
I'm happy to take us out. So if there's anything that we want you to take away from this episode, don't wait for inspiration. Pay attention. And we say that because your audience, your business, your industry, they're already giving you some great episode ideas. So keep that in mind. Um, you add a little structure. Ray talked about the editorial calendar. If you add a little structure to that and not just your storytelling, but your editorial calendar, if you do that, if you plan ahead, you know what happens, Ray? Your content will get a whole lot easier. And hopefully, not only your content will get a whole lot easier, just your workflow for your podcast will be smoother. You'll be happier. Your guests will be happier. Your audience will be happier because they're going to be listening to a much more, for lack of a better term, professional podcast.
Couldn't have said it better. Thank you, Steve. And that closes out this episode. Next time that you hear us, Steve and I are going to be talking about really how guesting on a podcast. We talked a little bit about that here today, but we're going to really deep dive into guesting on a podcast, how to be a good guest, because that's one way to start getting yourself in front of folks. But then the flip side is how to, be good to your guests. And so that's next episode when we tackle chapter 6 of podcasting for small business. So with that, for Steve Orr and myself, Ray Sidney Smith, take care. Here's to your next podcast.